watching Channel Africa Conversations.
And I'm hoping that Netumbo, and obviously I wish her all the very best, but people will be very quickly sitting in judgment of her if she's not able to deliver on things. She's made big promises. She's already said she promised to create 500,000 jobs, putting 85 billion Namibia dollars into that.
We continue with our conversation of Namibia celebrating 35 years of independence. And it comes also with an historic change of leadership for the country, seeing its first female president in its history. But also, sadly, at a time when a founding father, Dr. Sam Nuoma, passed away and won't be part of this year's celebrations. But somebody who has been watching the Namibian story for decades and, in fact, contributed immensely towards the country's independence through the work that she did as a journalist, often at great personal cost, is veteran journalist and author Gwen Lister. She joins us now. Gwen, thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Just before the break, we spoke to Dr. Mwende, and the first question I asked him was to take us back to 1990, a significant time in the country's history, independence. Tell me about how you saw that day, because you also had your journalist hat on, but there was also, I guess, a sense of, we've done it.
Absolutely. Peter, I would guess, I think euphoria was certainly part of what I felt at the time. I do remember standing on the field as the South African flag was lowered and the Namibian flag was raised, and feeling that this was really the start of a new era, the opportunity for Namibians now to shake off the shackles of apartheid and determine their own destiny. So I think it was mainly that feeling of euphoria at the time.
So take us to the period before, because I think sometimes we forget this victory was not easily won, and a lot of struggle literally had to have been endured to get the independence that Namibians can take for granted now. You were very close to the SWAPO leadership. You reported on what was going on in the country at the time. Take us through that period before independence, and particularly Sam Nuoma leading the struggle.
Well, I think obviously, Peter, you would know that it's a very long and very complex story, but I'll try and shorten it. And obviously, I came to Namibia as a journalist in 1976, really because I thought change must come in the Southern African continent, apartheid must fall, and I guessed it would happen in Namibia far quicker than it would happen in South Africa itself. That, in fact, did play out in that way. But it was very, very difficult being a journalist at a time when the apartheid regime really had no time for press freedom or for the Namibians to exercise their opposition to apartheid and to claim for themselves self-determination and to get independence for what was then Africa's last colony. So it was a hard struggle. I did manage to get, I could say, the trust of the SWAPO leadership at the time, Sam Nuoma in particular, because even though they were in exile, they watched closely my kind of reporting. And really what I wanted to do was kind of offset the South African propaganda about SWAPO being communists and wanting to raise the red flag about Windhoek, and really to give a human face to the movement. And so in the course of my work as a journalist, I traveled quite frequently abroad to meet with Nuoma and the SWAPO leadership, and would come back and report on those things. And obviously that got me into a lot of hot water at the time. Resolution 435 was adopted, of course, in 1978. And it took 10 years plus to get it implemented. It was something we thought would never happen. At the time, of course, South Africa was busy trying to put in place an internal settlement and exclude SWAPO from that Namibian equation. And one of our tasks as journalists was simply to point out that this wouldn't work, that without SWAPO as part of the picture, Namibian independence would never be true or be real. So it was gratifying that eventually, I mean, obviously due to a lot of geopolitical considerations, South Africa got a bit of a bloody nose in Angola with the Cuban forces, and I think South Africans themselves got tired of the body bags coming home. Economically, things were not good, and finally South Africa acquiesced and agreed to the implementation of the settlement plan. And so, of course, as we all know, that happened in the year 1989, where we had supervised elections, SWAPO returned from exile, and we finally elected, it was a SWAPO government in March of 1989.
How significant was Sam Nyoma's leadership at that time and in the early years of Namibia?
I think incredibly significant. There was no doubt that Nyoma was the undisputed leader of SWAPO. I mean, there had been attempts over the years to contest his leadership, but those uprisings, if one could term it that, like the Shipanga Rebellion, were quickly squashed. Nyoma was disciplined as a leader. He's always been a man who's been unequivocally committed, both pre and post-independence, to Namibia. I always used to think that covering him pre-independence, that all he really thought of was the freedom of Namibia. It was constant. He never lost sight of those goals. But at the same time, he was something of an authoritarian. There's no question about that. And of course, the Lubango camps still haunt SWAPO all these decades later. The fact that they'd accused so many SWAPO members in exile of being spies for the South African regime. And that resulted obviously in Lubango, which was a very unpleasant chapter in Namibia's history. And SWAPO has never really acknowledged, if that's the right word, certainly under Nyoma's leadership, he refused to allow that to happen, for SWAPO to apologize to many of those people who had been unjustly detained and tortured in exile. So yes, Nyoma was a very committed leader. I would argue that he was a better leader of a liberation struggle than he was president of an independent democratic country. But yes, as I say, as the leader of SWAPO, he was unquestioningly the commander-in-chief and calling all the shots.
And you raise an interesting idea and thought there, because I think it's one that we've seen play out in several countries, particularly in Southern Africa, where liberation leaders often struggle to fully transition to post-liberation leadership. I'm curious about the country that Namibia became. During this struggle, press freedom was a big issue for you, and it's something that became and continues to be important for you. Was it necessary post-independence?
Absolutely. I think, you know, one of the things, having started an independent newspaper back in the struggle years, it became very, very important for all of us, specifically those working as independent journalists at the time, and it was only a handful of us, that press freedom should be something that should definitely be enshrined in the constitution of a future independent Namibia. I mean, under apartheid, as is well known, we tried to exercise the right to press freedom, even though there was great oppression and repression for much of our reporting, especially when it concerned the atrocities committed by the South African Defence Forces and security forces against the civilian population of Namibia, particularly those in the far north, where there was always a virtual state of martial law and dusk to dawn curfews. So as I say, we felt press freedom was very, very important, really to speak for especially at the time, the oppressed people of Namibia who had no voice. SWAPO was not a banned organization then, unlike the ANC, but unofficially, of course it was. And every time they held a rally or their leaders spoke out, they were jailed and arrested and harassed. So that was really what was happening under apartheid, and we wanted a better dispensation after independence with a Bill of Rights, with things that would guarantee not only press freedom, but freedom of expression and access to information.
And has that been something that you've been allowed to enjoy in an independent Namibia? Because once a party's fortunes and popularity start to wane, often a heavier and heavier hand comes into play. Is that something that you've seen in Namibia?
Well, look, credit must be due to Nyoma, who, as I say, came in as the president of the country and was somewhat uncomfortable, if that's the right word, with democracy all of a sudden. He'd called all the shots in exile, and now obviously had to choose a cabinet and be inclusive in the way that he did that. And I must say he was. And he did give great thought to inclusivity. He also, obviously, he was the architect of the policy of national reconciliation. So there's no doubt he wanted to head a country where, for example, the white compatriots here would not flee back to South Africa and in so doing destabilize Namibia. And he made sure to keep on, I think it was at the time about 15,000 white civil servants who he urged to stay on so that there could be stability. So I think Nyoma, there's no question that even though he didn't particularly like democracy, he certainly did give a lot of thought and wanted stability and wanted peace for the country. And I think so too the issue of press freedom. Suddenly there were media coming into play who criticized him left, right, and center. I don't think he liked it. The Namibian too, in transition from the struggle years to independence, felt that we now needed to hold the SWAPO government to account in as much as we had done with the South African government before it. And this again did not sit comfortably with Nyoma. And as most people know, in the year 2000, he put a ban on the purchase and government advertising in the Namibian newspaper. So that was something of a turning point. But to be quite honest, that was probably one of the few things that happened. We did have a very conflictual relationship with Nyoma in the sort of post-independence years. But at the same time, no journalist was ever arrested or detained or killed. And I think generally speaking, although there have been hiccups and things have not been perfect, I think one of the standouts of Namibia's achievements since independence has been that commitment to press freedom, which was reluctantly taken on by Nyoma, but taken on with some enthusiasm by our late President Geingob, who obviously passed away in February last year. But he was very proud of the fact that Namibia was usually in the top 3 places of press freedom in Africa, according to the RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières Press Freedom Barometer. And he was delighted when we came on top. That having been said, I would like that to happen inside Namibia, but we're never prepared to spread the gospel of press freedom further afield and speak out where other countries violated rights of press freedom, even though I usually encourage them to put their money where their mouths were and do that as well.
In the period up to independence, your reporting necessarily was about human rights abuses, the struggle for freedom, injustice, all of that. What did your reporting switch to post-1990 that perhaps in a way led us to what we saw in the last election, where it was touch and go whether SWAPO would hold on to power?
Well, I think definitely there was, as I say, prior to independence, there was no question that our focus was almost exclusively on human rights and violations. We wanted to show the outside world what was happening under the jackboot of apartheid, and I think it was important that our focus was in that regard. So there were other areas that we possibly neglected because of that primary focus on human rights. Post-independence, obviously a slightly different scenario. Human rights were now guaranteed in terms of our constitution. That's not to say everything again was perfect since independence. We had our Caprivi, what it was then, secession attempt. We also had the fact that under Nyoma's leadership, the FAPLA in Angola were allowed to pursue former UNITA rebels into Namibia, and there were a lot of human rights violations at that time by our special field forces and so on. There was also a campaign that Nyoma launched against homosexuality in Namibia, and there were some ugly incidents around that. But generally speaking, Namibia's peace has been fairly undisturbed and since 1990.
So why has SWAPO's popularity waned? Is it just a normal course of events that we see in good democracies where people at some point just want change?
No, well, I think it's more complex than that, in the sense that I remember doing an interview with Sam Nyoma prior to independence, where he told me, and I was quite inspired by that at the time, that he wanted Namibia to be what he called Africa's first success story. And that was very significant. And I think, unfortunately, at the time of his death just recently, that dream, if it can be described as such, was not and has not been realized. And I think it's really to do with the economy, with the incredibly high rate of joblessness. Our unemployment is set at just under 40%. I believe it may be greater than that. The youth are getting impatient. As Dr. Mbwende pointed out earlier, Namibia is a big country, but with a relatively small population of about 2.6 million. And, you know, honestly speaking, one would think that one should be able to feed, clothe, house, educate, and give healthcare to the majority of those people there, but that's not been the case. The reasons for that, I think, are multifaceted. I do believe that things like entitlement, jobs for comrades, things like that, the tenderpreneurialism has really contributed, I think, to that. And I don't want to jump ahead, but if it comes to the challenges that our new president faces, I think that's going to be the major one. How to really get the youth to once again believe that SWAPO can deliver. Because I think the election late last year were very clear. There's change afoot. Canadians weren't quite ready to get rid of SWAPO yet, but I think they've been put on cognizance. Their majority has been significantly slimmed down. There are not a lot more younger people in Parliament, and I think come the next elections in 5 years' time, SWAPO will need to have delivered in economic terms, or will face, I think, what has happened in Botswana and to a certain degree, South Africa.
So let's talk about President-elect Ndaitwah. What's your first memory and interaction with her? And what's your sense of what Namibia might expect under her leadership?
Well, I must say, in the struggle years, going to visit and interview SWAPO in exile, I must be honest that I think I only met Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah on one occasion. Most of the leadership that I met with all the time were the male leadership. I did not interact much with the female leaders who weren't at the top of the heap at that point. But observations over the years about Ndaitwah is that she's a very strong woman. And I think, and I'm hoping as a woman myself, that she can deliver, that she will be prepared to kind of exercise her independence, which is not an easy task to do when one is so immersed in the liberation movement, the former liberation movement, as she is. Can she break those shackles of SWAPO commitment to what will need to be done to tackle things like corruption, entitlement. There's a lot of that happening. Um, can she take her own people to task in the way that her male predecessors have not been able to do, with a small exception of the fish rot incident where 2 cabinet ministers were and continue to be jailed. So I think she seems very committed to the issue of tackling corruption. But as I say, time will tell to what extent she's able to grab a hold of that and make a difference.
So March 2021, an important day. Her inauguration will take place. SWAPO, a very much smaller majority. What do you get in terms of a sense of the mood of the country? Will they be excited about her inauguration, or will there be interest because she's female and maybe a hope that things change, get better? What's it going to be like? Because 1990 was huge. This should also be huge.
I think, there is a sense of excitement. I don't think that everybody, even within SWAPO ranks, were terribly keen on the idea of a woman president. I think what is really marked about Namibia at the moment is the inherent conservatism in our country. I think compared to South Africa, I think it's very unfortunate, and I wish it wasn't the case. But I think there are pockets of people who don't believe in women in leadership. At the same time, I think her election is very significant. As we know, Africa has seen, 3 female presidents. Even the so-called first world United States of America has never had a woman president. So I think we all, especially women, are really prepared to give her a chance. But I think it must also be said that certainly even within SWAPO ranks, I think a lot of men will be judged probably more strict than they would have judged their male predecessors. So I think the jury's out on that, and I'm hoping that Netumbo, and obviously I wish her all the very best, but people will be very quickly sitting in judgment of her if she's not able to deliver on things. She's made big promises. She's already said she promised to create 500,000 jobs, putting 85 billion Namibia dollars into that. Subsequently, they readdressed that and halved the figure. She's promised the revival of Air Namibia, which died in dormancy some years ago. She's promised new stadiums for Namibia because our soccer stadiums were in such a mess. Our teams had to practice in South Africa and elsewhere, our national team. So she's made a lot of promises, and people are going to be holding her quite dramatically to that. But as I say, I'm hoping for the best, that she's able to exercise more independence in terms of breaking out of SWAPO, recognizing others outside the ruling party, even if it is for position in government, looking at merit-based appointments, having more time than her predecessors for civil society, which is very important and very fragile and vulnerable in Namibia. And of course, first and foremost, really adhering to human rights, recognition and press freedom. Hopefully we can keep those flags aloft in the coming years.
All right, and perhaps finally, as a journalist, someone who then is trained to observe and record, when you look at the Namibia story in its totality, from pre-independence, independence, and the time after, what's your view of it all? How do you see that story?
You know, Peter, as someone, as I say, who's been through it all, I must say I was an idealist, and I really believed in those words that Sam Nujoma told me, that Namibia could be the first success story in Africa at the time. I did believe in a country as big as ours, with such a small population, that there was opportunity, there was hope, there was chance, if our resources were properly used, that we could have at least people, Namibians, who came to enjoy, if that's the right word, the fruits of independence, which is always referred to, the fruits of independence. But I'm afraid that has not happened. And in a sense, I have to keep reminding myself that achievements have been made, that largely speaking, there is peace and stability, that largely speaking, there is adherence to human rights. Those were the things, after all, that were the greatest scourge under apartheid. But at the same time, I think the economic, what our president for a year, President Pumba, referred to as the second struggle for economic independence, really needs to be taken on. And really government has to stamp down on corruption, because if they do, and they are seen to do that, I think even those who are poor and will see that something is being done. And that would give great encouragement. I mean, we saw just about a week ago that government has decided to double the subsistence and travel allowances for civil servants. Now, I think if I was Netumbo, I would be saying, guys, let's cut that back. That isn't happening. So I think it is gestures like that which will be very important. She is, for example, not a great believer, it seems, in the green hydrogen industry, which is kind of being mooted as a great economic prospect for Namibia, along with oil finds along our coast. I'm not sure that that's going to deliver, and I don't think Netumbo is very sure whether that's going to deliver. So where she's going to get 250,000 jobs from, I don't know, but I wish her well with that. As I say, if she can manage to create more employment, I think that would help probably to mend the confidence in SWAPO that is waning rapidly in the country. If not, I think SWAPO will probably lose the next elections.
Gwen Lister, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and helping us make sense of this journey that Namibia has been on. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Peter. All the best.
Thank you. That was Gwen Lister, veteran journalist in Namibia, who has been writing the story since before independence and then through the last 35 years as the country celebrates that milestone, and also the start of a new era of leadership under President-elect Ndaitwah. And that's how we come to the end of today's edition of Channel Africa Conversations. Thanks very much indeed for tuning in. And a reminder before we go that we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to get your comments and your thoughts on our social media platforms, and they're on your screen now. And you can start with this one straight away. So what do we want to know from you? What you think of the program, what kind of conversations you'd like us to have, and with who. So drop your thoughts and your notes on our social media platforms, and we'll certainly start to make sure that these conversations are the kind of conversations that you want to hear. All right, until the next time, take care.